I never thought I'd have to fight my own mother for something that was rightfully mine. But if there was one thing I had learned growing up, it was that my mother, Linda, didn't believe in fairness only in what she felt she deserved. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the only real parent I ever had. She was warm, steady, and unshakably strong, the kind of woman who never needed to raise her voice to command respect. She ran her farm with the same patience and resilience she used to raise me, teaching me the value of hard work and honesty. My summers were spent in her fields, helping with the horses, picking vegetables, and sitting on the wraparound porch in the evenings, listening to her tell stories about the land that had been in our family for generations. My mother, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different. Linda saw Grandma's farm as a burden, an outdated relic of a life she had been desperate to escape from. She left as soon as she turned 18, chasing city lights, luxury, and, most of all, men who could give her both. I was born when she was barely 20, the result of a fleeting romance with a man whose name she barely bothered to remember. Raising a child didn't fit into her plans, so she left me with Grandma for a little while. A little while turned into a lifetime. She never wanted the farm when Grandma was alive. If she visited at all, it was for show, bringing whatever man she was dating at the time and bragging about how quaint her childhood home was. When I was younger, I'd wait at the driveway, hoping she'd actually stay long enough to tuck me into bed or read me a story. But Linda always left as quickly as she arrived, waving her manicured hand as she climbed into whatever expensive car her latest boyfriend drove. She wasn't there when Grandma's health started to decline. She wasn't there for the doctor visits, the long nights when I sat by her bedside, or the day I held her hand as she took her final breath. But the moment Grandma's will was read, Linda showed up, and suddenly, the farm she had never cared for became her retirement dream. I still remember the moment the lawyer, Mr. Callahan, cleared his throat and read the words that changed everything. I, Eleanor Martin, leave my estate, including my home and farmland, to my granddaughter, Emily Martin. There was a long silence. Then Linda laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "That's a mistake," she said, leaning forward. "Mom would have left it to me." Mr. Callahan adjusted his glasses and shook his head. "Your mother's will is clear. The farm, house, and all associated assets belong solely to Emily." Linda's expression darkened. "That can't be right. I'm her daughter. I should be the one inheriting the farm, not—" She turned to me with narrowed eyes, her voice laced with venom. "Not some kid who doesn't even know what to do with it." I should have been prepared for this. Deep down, I had always known my mother saw me as nothing more than an afterthought, a responsibility she had long ago abandoned. But hearing the disgust in her voice, the way she dismissed me as if I were a stranger trying to steal from her, made my stomach turn. "The will was notarized and legally binding," Mr. Callahan said firmly. "Eleanor was of sound mind when she made these decisions. There are no ambiguities. The farm is Emily's." Linda sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the way she was already plotting her next move. She didn't argue further, not yet. But I knew that this wasn't over. After the meeting, I drove straight back to the farm, pulling into the long gravel driveway. The sun was starting to set, casting golden light over the fields. It should have been a peaceful moment, a time to reflect on everything Grandma had left me. But instead, my hands were shaking. I had won on paper, but knowing my mother, she wasn't going to let this go. And I was right, because 3 days later, she showed up at the farm, suitcases in hand, acting like she already owned the place. I had barely finished my morning coffee when I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Peering through the kitchen window, I saw a sleek black sedan pulling up the driveway. My stomach dropped. Linda stepped out, wearing oversized sunglasses and a smug expression, dragging 2 large suitcases behind her. She wasn't here for a visit. She was here to move in. I opened the front door before she could knock. "What are you doing here?" She sighed dramatically, pushing past me like she owned the place. Emily, be a dear and help me with my bags. This driveway is murder on my heels. I stared at her, stunned. Linda! I never called her mom. She hadn't earned it. You can't just show up here unannounced with luggage. She set down her purse and stretched, eyeing the living room like she was inspecting a hotel suite. Oh, relax. This house is far too big for just you. I'm moving in. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. No, you're not. Linda tilted her head, feigning confusion. Oh, honey, don't be selfish. You don't even need this farm. You have your whole life ahead of you. I, on the other hand, have worked tirelessly for decades. I deserve a peaceful retirement. I crossed my arms. You didn't even want this place before Grandma left it to me. Her face darkened for a fraction of a second before she recovered, plastering on a condescending smile. Because I didn't think I had to fight my own daughter for what should have rightfully been mine, but I see now that I need to take matters into my own hands. I scoffed. The will was clear. This farm belongs to me. You don't get to just claim it because you feel like it. She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, please. Lawyers make mistakes all the time. I'll talk to Callahan again. Get things straightened out. I clenched my jaw. The only mistake was you thinking you can walk in here and take over my home. Linda ignored me and started wandering through the house. Ugh, this place needs a serious makeover. I'm thinking a full remodel, tear down those ugly cabinets, replace the flooring with something more modern, and of course, I'll need the master bedroom. That was it. I stepped in front of her, blocking her path. No, you are not moving in. You are not touching a single thing in this house. You need to leave. She let out a sharp laugh. Oh, sweetheart, don't be ridiculous. I'm your mother. You wouldn't throw your own mother out onto the streets, would you? Onto the streets? I repeated incredulously. You have an apartment, Linda, a fancy one in the city that you brag about constantly. Go back to it. She huffed. Well, I'm letting that place go. No point in keeping it when I have this farm. It's just common sense. The audacity, the sheer entitlement. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice even. You are not staying here. If you don't leave willingly, I'll call the police. For the first time, Linda looked genuinely surprised. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Her expression hardened. I gave birth to you, Emily. That means this farm is just as much mine as it is yours. I held my ground. That's not how it works. You abandoned this place. You abandoned me. Grandma wanted me to have it. And I'm going to honor her wishes, whether you like it or not. She stared at me for a long moment, her face twisting as if she couldn't decide whether to argue or play the victim. Finally, she exhaled sharply and grabbed her bags. This isn't over, she said, voice dripping with venom. She stormed out, throwing her suitcases into the trunk with more force than necessary before speeding off down the driveway. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding, watching the dust settle behind her car. She was right about one thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that my mother's little stunt had been an impulsive tantrum, a last-ditch effort to bully me into giving up the farm. That after I stood my ground, she'd realize she had lost and move on. I was wrong. Linda wasn't done, not even close. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were just annoying. A few missed calls from an unknown number, then texts from Linda demanding I come to my senses and do the right thing. Then the messages turned guilt-ridden. How could you do this to your own mother after everything I've done for you? And when guilt didn't work, she switched tactics. You think you can keep this place? You don't have what it takes to run a farm, Emily. You'll be begging for my help in a few months. I ignored her, deleting every text without responding. But Linda was relentless. The calls became more frequent, ringing late into the night. Sometimes she wouldn't say anything, just heavy breathing on the line before hanging up. Other times, she left voicemails, rambling about how she was going to fix this situation. Then, she started bringing in reinforcements. My aunt, cousins, even a few distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Suddenly, they were all very interested in my well-being. Emily, sweetheart, Aunt Diane cooed in a voicemail. "I know things have been tense, but don't you think your mother deserves a little piece of the farm? She's your mother, family should come first." My cousin Leah sent a text. "I get that you're upset, but Grandma would have wanted you both to share it. It's only fair." Fair. That was rich. None of them had been here for Grandma. None of them had sat by her bedside, held her frail hands, or listened to her last words. But now, when there was land, property, money at stake, they had opinions. When I still didn't respond, Linda upped the ante. She started showing up. At first, it was just her car idling at the end of the driveway, sitting there for hours, watching. I refused to engage. I stayed inside, locked the doors, and carried on with my day. Then she started coming up to the house. One morning, I walked outside to find Linda standing on the porch, arms crossed. "You need to leave," I said, barely containing my rage. She scoffed. "You're being so dramatic, Emily. I'm just here to check on my home." "It's not your home." She smiled sweetly, her voice syrupy with condescension. "Oh, honey, you think a piece of paper changes the fact that I deserve this place more than you?" I clenched my fists. "You were never here when Grandma needed you. You never cared about this farm." "And what, you do? You're playing house on a property you can't even manage. You're just a little girl pretending to be in charge." I took a deep breath. "Leave, Linda." She didn't. Not right away. Instead, she leaned in closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "You won't last, Emily. You think you're tough, but you'll break. And when you do, I'll be right here, waiting." I slammed the door in her face. That night, I installed new locks and ordered security cameras. The next time she came, she tried to push her way inside. When I blocked her, she sneered. "What, now you're locking your own mother out?" "Yes." Her expression twisted. "This is my home. You can't keep me out of it." I folded my arms. "Watch me." Linda huffed, stepping back onto the porch. "You're making a mistake." "No, you did, when you thought you could steal this from me." She stormed off, but I knew she wasn't done, and I was right. A few days later, I got a call from a realtor. "Hi, Ms. Martin. This is Daniel with Evergreen Realty. Your mother contacted us about listing the farm for sale, and we'd like to schedule—" I nearly dropped my phone. "She what?" "She said she was the owner and ready to put the property on the market." I cut him off. "She doesn't own this farm. I do. Don't waste your time." There was a pause before he responded carefully. "She seemed pretty insistent." I clenched my jaw. "She's lying." I called Linda immediately. She picked up on the second ring, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. Well, well, well. I was wondering when you'd call me back." "You tried to sell my farm?" She laughed. "Our farm, Emily. You can't keep something this big all to yourself. It needs someone who knows what they're doing." "Which is not you." "Oh, honey." Her voice was laced with amusement. "You don't understand. I will get what I want, one way or another." I hung up. Enough was enough. I called my lawyer. Mr. Callahan didn't sound surprised. "I was afraid she'd pull something like this." "She won't stop," I said. "She's harassing me, showing up at the house, trying to sell my property." "Then it's time to escalate." By the end of the day, I had official trespassing notices drawn up. I emailed the realtor a copy of the will and proof of ownership, ensuring that Linda couldn't get a single step closer to selling. And then I had the locks changed again. This time, I made sure Linda knew about it. The next morning, I found her outside again, yanking at the door handle like a lunatic. When it didn't budge, she spun around, rage written all over her face. "Are you kidding me?" I crossed my arms. "I warned you." "You had the locks changed again? To keep me out?" "Yes." She let out a bitter laugh. "You're disgusting, Emily. Your own mother." "You are not my problem anymore," I said coldly. "And if you step foot on this property again, I will call the police." She stilled, her expression unreadable. "You wouldn't dare." I lifted my phone. "Try me." For the first time, she looked nervous. She turned, storming back toward her car. Before getting in, she shot me one last look. "This isn't over," she spat. I smiled. Oh, I know. I thought changing the locks and involving a lawyer would finally get Linda to back off. I underestimated just how desperate and reckless she could be. 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of a truck pulling into my driveway. My stomach twisted as I peered through the curtains. Linda stood there, dressed in an expensive beige coat, arms crossed as two men, a moving crew, stepped out of the truck. I threw open the door. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Linda smirked. "Oh, sweetheart, I told you this wasn't over." She turned to the movers. "Start with the big furniture first. I want my mother's bedroom set brought in first." The men hesitated, looking at me. "Ma'am?" one of them asked. I stepped onto the porch, hands clenched into fists. "She doesn't live here. She has no right to move in. If you touch a single thing, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Linda's smirk faltered. "Emily, stop being dramatic." I pulled out my phone. "Last warning, Linda. You need to leave." Linda scoffed but turned back to the movers, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Ignore her. She's just confused. I own this property. My idiot daughter thinks she has some legal claim, but the courts will rule in my favor soon enough." One of the movers frowned. "Ma'am, do you have proof of ownership?" I smirked and held up my deed. "Yeah, Linda, do you?" Her expression twisted, but before she could answer, a police car turned onto the driveway. I exhaled in relief, right on time. Linda spun around, eyes wide. "You called the police?" I crossed my arms. "I warned you." Officer Harris, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, stepped out of the squad car. "Ms. Martin?" I stepped forward. "That's me. My mother is trespassing on my property. I've already filed a formal complaint against her." I handed him a copy of the legal notice my lawyer had drafted. He scanned it, then turned to Linda. "Ma'am, you're trespassing on private property. I need you to leave." Linda's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is my farm. That will is fraudulent. My mother never would have left this place to an ungrateful brat." Officer Harris didn't blink. "Ma'am, unless you have legal documentation proving ownership, you need to vacate the premises immediately." Linda let out a shrill laugh. "I raised this girl. I gave her life. And she's calling the cops on me? This is elder abuse." I rolled my eyes. "Linda, you dumped me on Grandma's doorstep when I was 5 and only came back when there was something to take." Officer Harris's expression remained neutral. "Ma'am, I won't ask again. Get in your car and leave." Linda's entire body was shaking with fury now. She turned to the movers. "Do something! She's stealing my home. You can't just let this happen." The movers looked deeply uncomfortable. We're gonna go," one muttered. They climbed back into the truck and peeled out of the driveway as fast as possible. Linda whirled back to me. "You manipulative little snake." I met her glare without flinching. "You lost, Linda. It's over." She lunged at me. I barely had time to step back before Officer Harris grabbed her arm. "That's enough," he barked. "You're under arrest for trespassing and assault." Linda shrieked like a banshee. "You can't do this! I'm her mother! I have rights!" "You have the right to remain silent," Officer Harris said calmly as he snapped the cuffs around her wrists. I watched, heartbeat pounding, as my mother, the woman who had spent her whole life treating me like an inconvenience, was dragged toward the police car. She kicked and screamed the whole way. "Emily, you'll regret this. You'll come crawling back to me when you realize you can't handle this farm." I folded my arms, voice ice cold. "I handled Grandma's illness, her funeral, and keeping this farm running without you. I'll be just fine." Linda was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser. Officer Harris shut the door and turned to me. "We'll take her in for booking. If she shows up here again, file another complaint, and we'll escalate from there." I nodded. "Thank you, officer." As they drove off, I stood there, watching the dust settle in the driveway. I expected to feel guilty. I didn't. All I felt was relief. Linda had spent her whole life trying to take from me. Not anymore. This farm was mine, and no one was ever taking it away from me again. The house was quiet. Peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for Linda to show up unannounced. I wasn't fielding phone calls from relatives or dealing with threats disguised as guilt trips. The farm, the home Grandma had entrusted to me, was finally mine. Linda spent the night in county jail before being released the next morning. I knew she'd call as soon as she got out, and I wasn't wrong. The moment my phone rang and her name flashed on the screen, I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, I listened to the message. "Emily, this is ridiculous. You're really going to let your own mother be humiliated like this over a stupid farm? You owe me an apology. Call me back." I smiled and deleted it. A few hours later, another voicemail came through. This time, her voice was shaking with barely restrained rage. "You think you've won? You haven't. You're just a selfish little brat playing pretend. That farm is too much for you. You'll ruin it, and when you do, don't come crawling to me for help." Deleted. The third voicemail, late that night, was quieter, more calculated. "I hope you know you've destroyed this family. People are talking, Emily. No one's on your side. When you realize you've made a huge mistake, don't expect anyone to take you back." Deleted. The next day, I sent out a mass text to the relatives who had taken Linda's side. "For those of you who called to tell me I was being unreasonable, I hope you now understand the kind of person Linda is. She tried to sell the farm out from under me. She called movers to force her way in. She attacked me when I told her no. I gave her every opportunity to respect Grandma's wishes, and she spat in my face. If you still think I was wrong to stand my ground, then I don't need you in my life. I'm done justifying myself." Then I blocked every single one of them. I expected some backlash, maybe even a few desperate attempts to change my mind, but instead, all I got was silence. Apparently, no one wanted to fight for Linda once they realized she was a lost cause. The next few weeks were blissfully uneventful. I focused on the farm, fixing up the house, getting things back in order after all the chaos. I spent evenings sitting on the porch, sipping sweet tea, watching the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Linda, on the other hand, had not moved on. I heard from a neighbor that she had been venting about me to anyone who would listen. She claimed I had stolen the farm from her, that I had been brainwashed by Grandma into thinking I was more important than I actually was. I didn't care. I knew the truth. And more importantly, she knew the truth too. A few months later, I got word that Linda had lost her apartment after falling behind on rent. Her city friends, the ones she had always bragged about, didn't offer to take her in. She had burned too many bridges. And yet, she still had the audacity to send me one final email. "Emily, I know we've had our differences, but I'm still your mother. I think it's time we put the past behind us. I'll be coming by in a few days, and we can talk about me moving in. It's what's best for both of us." I laughed out loud. Then I replied, "Linda, I think you misunderstood. You are not welcome here. Not now, not ever. If you show up, I will call the police again. You made your choices. Live with them." And I never heard from her again.